So I basically was talking about something that was more recent, a little more than 50 years ago, when the young scientists in the United States became very involved in politics, triggered by the Vietnam War and the fact that young men were going to the draft. And they didn't really like it. And many of them were scientists. Some of them had even worked in what was called the military-industrial complex. So at MIT, where I was, they had an event which was considered to be a work stoppage, but in fact, they canceled classes for the day. But it was on March 4th, 1969. And the importance of that was that it gathered the students and the faculty that were opposed to just unilateral cooperation with the government in war efforts, and said, we have to be better than that. We have to expand, and we have to show that science actually can be used for helpful purposes. And one of the people who spoke was George Wall, who was one of the Nobel laureates. And he spoke really about a topic that became climate change. And it was called that even at the time, but they were just starting to make the public aware of it. But in addition, a more important thing happened as a result of that. Two of the people who had been very involved in organizing it, Kurt Godfrey and the Nobel laureate Henry Kendall, formed something called the Union of Concerned Scientists, which has gone on to be a worldwide operation where if something happens scientifically, they can quickly communicate with people all over the world. So there is an active science group. Later, many years later, I became involved with something called the Global Virus Network, which turned out to be critical during COVID. And I, by then, had stopped working with them. I had moved to the University of Texas at Arlington, where I was working in the genomics laboratory. But because I knew the geneticists and I knew the virologists, we were able to set up a testing facility for COVID within our own university. And that helped our university, number one, financially, because we did it ourselves. But it also helped the students who were somewhat stranded at the university. They couldn't go home. They couldn't go anywhere. And then the athletes who had to have testing for in order to play. So what happens, I think, in a career in science is you go in and out of topics totally influenced by environmental factors, even if you're not aware of them. I mean, at the time I was at MIT, I was a graduate student finishing up. The war was there. It impacted all of us. Right after that period, and the war didn't end for a number of years, the women's movement came up. And a book called Our Body, Ourselves was written. I don't know if you know about it, but it was a book that transformed consumers, women consumers, into knowledgeable people about their reproductive issues, contraceptive, birth control of many forms, and what the doctors were talking about. And also, I think was one of the first movements that actually gave rise to patients having a say in what they wanted. And so I was involved. I went to medical school, then I went back to Boston for my training in obstetrics and gynecology. And I was involved to a certain degree with that feminist retrospective movement at the time, which now you look back and you say that was a major historical event in the United States, was the issuing of Our Bodies, Ourselves. I wasn't part of it.
What do you think happens today in Russia with the drafting of young men and with the science?
It may the drafting of the young men may have the same effect it had in the United States with the Vietnam War. They started to protest, and it led to eventually the cessation of the war and the elimination of the draft. So, you know, it just depends on how the whole population, and the whole population in the United States gradually shifted to that point of view. I can't possibly say what's going to happen in Russia, but there are some parallels.